When did teaching someone a lesson completely backfire? My brother Lionel had this girl pinned against her car while she fumbled with her pepper spray. "I know where you live," he said, leaning in close enough that she turned her face away from his breath. "And I know your roommate's gone till Sunday, so you can either invite me over tonight or I'll just show up myself." "Lionel, the cops are coming," I called out, which was a lie, but it made him step back long enough for Madison to dive into her car and peel out of the parking lot. This was Lionel's thing. He'd been harassing girls since high school when he figured out that being 6'3" and muscular meant he could make girls too scared to say no. He once followed our dental hygienist home after she declined his advances and sat outside her house all night, texting her photos of her own front door. The manager at his job had 4 complaints about him cornering female customers. That night, I met up with my friend Mia and told her what happened while she took notes for her psychology thesis on predatory behavior. "Your brother needs to experience what he's been doing to these women," she said. "He's too stupid to learn from that," I said. "His brain literally doesn't make those connections." "Then at least he'll suffer," Mia said. "Let him see how he likes being hunted." The next Monday, Mia showed up his work before opening and pressed herself against the glass doors until Lionel arrived. She followed him inside and stood at his register for 40 minutes, describing their future children while he tried to help other customers. By Wednesday, she was texting him photos she'd taken of him sleeping through his bedroom window. She found out his gym schedule and started showing up to spot him during bench press, her face hovering inches above his, while she whispered, "You're so strong, baby." She learned his Friday night bar and brought friends who formed a circle around him on the dance floor, grinding against him while he tried to escape. "This psycho won't leave me alone," Lionel said at dinner, his hands actually shaking as he showed us the latest texts. "She's everywhere I go and the cops won't do anything because she hasn't technically threatened me, but I know she's dangerous." "Maybe she just really likes you," our dad said, laughing. "You should be flattered such a pretty girl is interested." Mia escalated beautifully. She sent 200 texts in one night detailing their future together. She mailed love letters to his work, written in what looked like blood. She convinced his manager she was his girlfriend and got his schedule changed so they'd always work the same shifts once she got herself hired there. She showed up at our house at 3 a.m. playing their song on repeat from a Bluetooth speaker until the neighbors called the cops. After a month, Lionel had lost 15 pounds from not eating. He'd started sleeping in his car in different parking lots each night because he was convinced Mia had made copies of our house keys. He jumped every time his phone buzzed and had started carrying pepper spray, which he gripped constantly like a lifeline. His hands shook all the time now, and he'd developed this twitch where he'd constantly look over his shoulder even when we were just watching TV. "I can't take this anymore," he said, crying actual tears. "I'm scared to go to work because she'll be there, and I'm scared to quit because then she'll just follow me to the next job. I check my back seat before getting in my car every time. I can't sleep because every noise might be her breaking in. Why won't she just accept that I said no?" he asked me, completely missing the irony while filling out the forms with trembling hands. "I've been crystal clear that I'm not interested, but she acts like my rejection is just foreplay. Kind of like how Madison told you no, but you followed her anyway," I said. "Or how that dental hygienist said she wasn't interested, but you sat outside her house all night." Lionel's face went red. "That's completely different because those girls actually liked it, but society tells them they have to play hard to get." Madison was smiling when she walked into work the next day, because deep down she was flattered. "She filed a restraining order, Lionel, which she dropped after 2 weeks because she realized she missed the attention. This psycho is actually dangerous, and I'm genuinely afraid for my life. Girls like being pursued because it makes them feel special, but what Mia's doing is straight-up harassment." "You told Madison you knew when her roommate would be gone," I said. "How is that not threatening?" "Because she loved that I paid that much attention to her life," he exploded. "Women want men who notice details, but this crazy woman is terrorizing me. I'm the actual victim here while those girls got exactly what they secretly wanted from me." I gave up. I realized he'd die on this hill believing every woman he'd stalked had actually loved it while he was the only real victim of harassment in history. I met with Mia to call off the experiment since Lionel clearly wasn't capable of self-reflection. "Let's stop before someone gets hurt because you're honestly scaring me with how good you are at this," I said. Mia stirred her coffee and smiled in a way that made my stomach drop. "I'm not stopping because I've actually fallen in love with your brother." "That's not funny," I said. "I'm dead serious. I actually already put deposits down on a wedding venue for next June because I know he'll come around eventually." I sat there frozen while my coffee went cold between us. Mia kept stirring hers in slow circles like we were discussing vacation plans, instead of her genuine plan to marry my brother, who was currently sleeping in his car, to avoid her. My hands started shaking, so I shoved them under the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. The whole point was to teach Lionel a lesson, not create an actual stalker who believed her own performance. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt tight. She looked so calm, so sure of herself, and I realized right then that I'd completely lost control of this situation. I had no idea how to stop what I'd started. I leaned forward and tried to keep my voice steady. "Look, the experiment worked," I said. "Lionel gets it now. He's scared and he understands what he put those women through. We need to stop this before someone actually gets hurt." Mia smiled at me like I'd said something cute. "What started as research became real feelings," she said. "I've never felt this connected to anyone before. I spend all day thinking about him and planning our future together." When I pointed out that Lionel was terrified and wanted nothing to do with her, she waved her hand dismissively. "That's just his defense mechanisms," she said. "He's been hurt before, so he puts up walls, but I can see through them. He'll understand our destiny eventually." I stared at her and felt my stomach drop. She actually believed this. This wasn't an act anymore. I grabbed my phone and keys and stood up so fast my chair scraped loud against the floor. Several people looked over at us. "I need to go," I said. Mia just smiled and went back to stirring her coffee. "I'll see you at the wedding," she called after me as I pushed through the door. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely unlock my phone. I called Lionel while walking to my car. He answered on the first ring. "We need to talk," I said. "It's about Mia. You need to know something." "What did you do?" he said. His voice was flat and cold. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Don't play stupid," he said. "You set this whole thing up, didn't you? You and your psycho friend planned this from the beginning." "No," I said. "I mean, yes, we started it, but it was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to teach you a lesson about how you treat women. Now she's actually obsessed and I can't make her stop." I heard him breathing hard on the other end. "So you admit it," he said. "You did this to me on purpose. My own brother." I tried to explain, but he cut me off. "I don't want to hear it," he said. "Stay away from me. Don't call me. Don't come to my apartment. Don't talk to me. We're done." The line went dead. I stood in the parking lot holding my phone and realized I'd just destroyed whatever relationship we had left. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Madison fumbling for her pepper spray while Lionel had her pinned against her car. I saw the dental hygienist getting photos of her own front door at midnight. I thought about all the women Lionel had terrorized and how I'd treated them like abstract concepts instead of real people. They felt exactly what Lionel was feeling now. The fear of being followed, the constant checking over their shoulders, the way their hands shook when their phones buzzed. I'd known all that intellectually, but I hadn't really understood it until I watched it happen to my brother. The parallel hit me so hard I felt sick, but knowing that didn't tell me how to fix what I'd unleashed. I got up at 6 the next morning because I couldn't sleep anyway. I opened my laptop and started searching for stalking laws and victim resources. I typed in phrases like how to stop a stalker and legal options for harassment victims. Most of the results were depressing. Restraining orders that stalkers ignored. Police who couldn't do anything until the stalker made a direct threat. Victims who felt helpless because the system couldn't protect them. I found the police department website and clicked through to their specialized units. Detective Cillian Powell's name was listed under the Stalking and Harassment Division. I called the number and got his voicemail. "This is Detective Powell," the recording said. "Leave a message with your name and number, and I'll return your call within 24 hours. I took a breath. "My name is Luke's son," I said. "I need advice about a stalking situation that's gotten out of hand. I was involved in starting it, and now I don't know how to stop it. Please call me back." I left my number and hung up. My phone rang 2 hours later. "This is Detective Powell," the voice said. "I got your message about a stalking situation. Can you come to the station this afternoon around 2? I said yes, and wrote down the address. The police station smelled like coffee and cleaning products. Powell met me in the lobby and led me to a small interview room with a table and 3 chairs. He was maybe 40 with gray starting at his temples. He gestured for me to sit. "Tell me what's going on," he said. I explained everything. How Lionel had been harassing women for years. How I'd asked Mia to give him a taste of his own medicine. How she'd started stalking him as an experiment, but now claimed she'd actually fallen in love with him. How she'd put deposits down on wedding venues. Powell took notes and didn't interrupt. When I finished, he looked up. "Stalking is stalking regardless of the victim's past behavior," he said. "Your brother deserves protection, even if he's done the same things to others. But I need him to file the complaint himself. I can't open a case based on secondhand information." I nodded. "He won't do it," I said. "He thinks it makes him look weak." Powell sighed. "That's common," he said, "especially with male victims. But without his cooperation, there's not much I can do officially." He leaned back in his chair. "Most stalking cases are hard to prosecute," he said. "The behavior usually stays just barely legal until it crosses into direct threats or violence. From what you're describing, this Mia sounds like she knows exactly where those lines are. She's being careful not to cross them yet. I felt my chest tighten. So what can we do? I asked. Documentation is key, Powell said. Every text, every sighting, every incident needs to be recorded with dates and times, screenshots of messages, photos if she shows up somewhere, witness statements from people who see it happening. Build a paper trail. The best first step is a civil restraining order, which has a lower burden of proof than criminal charges. It might not stop her, but it creates legal consequences if she violates it. He gave me the name of a victim advocate who could help with the process. Aisha Sterling, he said. She works with stalking victims and knows the system. Tell her I sent you. I met Aisha the next day at her office in a community center. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She shook my hand and offered me tea. Powell told me about your situation, she said. Let's talk about options. She pulled out a folder and opened it on the desk between us. There are two main paths, she said. Civil protection orders and criminal stalking charges. They're different processes with different standards of proof. A civil order is easier to get because you just need to show a pattern of unwanted contact that causes fear. Criminal charges require proving intent to harass or harm, which is harder. She walked me through the paperwork requirements. Detailed documentation with dates, times, and descriptions of each incident. Screenshots of texts and social media posts. Photos of Mia showing up at Lionel's workplace or gym. Witness statements from people who saw it happen. When I mentioned Lionel's own history of harassing women, Aisha's expression shifted slightly. Everyone deserves safety regardless of their past, she said carefully. But I'll be honest, his credibility might be challenged if this goes to court. The defense will likely bring up his history to suggest he's exaggerating or that he encouraged the attention initially. That's something to be prepared for. I left her office with a stack of forms and instructions. I called Lionel and asked to meet at a public cafe near his new apartment. He agreed reluctantly. When I got there, he was already sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall, so he could see the whole room. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, his hair unwashed, that constant shoulder-checking twitch every few seconds. I sat down across from him. I talked to a detective and a victim advocate, I said. They explained the process for getting a restraining order. You need to start documenting everything Mia does. Every text, every time she shows up somewhere, everything. Save it all with dates and times. Lionel shook his head. I'm not filing a police report, he said. That makes me look weak, like I can't handle some girl. It's not about being weak, I said. It's about creating legal consequences for her behavior. Right now, she can do whatever she wants, because there's no official record. A restraining order changes that. He was about to respond when the cafe door opened. Mia walked in. She looked around the room like she was searching for someone. Then her eyes landed on our table. She smiled. My whole body went cold. She walked over to a table about 15 feet away and sat down facing us. Then she pulled out her phone and held it up, clearly recording video. Lionel froze completely. His hand went to his jacket pocket where I knew he kept his pepper spray. His breathing got fast and shallow. We need to leave, I said quietly. She's documenting this. She's going to make it look like we're harassing her, or that you're engaging with her voluntarily. If you file charges later, she'll use this video to claim you wanted contact with her. We stood up and walked toward the exit. Mia kept her phone pointed at us the whole time, still smiling. Once we got outside, Lionel was shaking. That's what she does, he said. She shows up everywhere and acts like we're in a relationship. She makes it look like I want her around. I walked him to his car and checked the parking lot. 3 rows over, I saw Mia's car. She was going to follow him home again. I pulled out my phone and called Lionel before he could drive off. He answered on the first ring and I told him to wait, that Mia was in the parking lot and might follow him. He started breathing really fast through the phone, and I could hear that panicked sound he'd been making lately when things got too much. I walked over to his car and knocked on the window. He unlocked it, and I got in the passenger seat. His hands were shaking so bad he couldn't grip the steering wheel properly. I talked him through some breathing exercises that Aisha had mentioned, counting to 4 on the inhale and 8 on the exhale. It took about 10 minutes before his breathing slowed down enough that I felt okay about him driving. I checked the parking lot again, and Mia's car was still there, 3 rows back. I told Lionel to take a different route home than usual and to call me when he got inside his apartment. He nodded and started the engine. I watched him pull out of the parking space and head toward the exit. Mia's car started up right after and followed him out onto the street. I stood in the parking lot and dialed Powell's number. He picked up after 2 rings, and I explained what just happened at the cafe. I told him about Mia walking in and sitting near us, about her holding up her phone to record video the whole time. Powell was quiet for a second, and then said, That was actually pretty smart on her part. She was building her own story, making it look like we were the ones seeking her out or harassing her. He said this showed she understood how to work the system and was thinking ahead about her defense. I asked what Lionel should do, and Powell said documentation was crucial now. Every text, every sighting, every incident needed to be recorded with dates and times. Screenshots, photos, anything that could prove a pattern. Then Powell said something that made my stomach drop. He warned me that my involvement in starting this whole thing could become a problem if Mia decided to claim I was harassing her on Lionel's behalf. If she spun it right, she could make me look like the instigator and herself like the victim of a conspiracy. I hadn't thought about that angle. Powell said I should probably step back from direct involvement and let Lionel handle the official stuff himself, but that I should also keep my own documentation just in case. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. A woman said her name was Sylvia Montgomery, and she was calling from HR at Lionel's workplace. She explained that Lionel had listed me as his emergency contact on his employment paperwork. I asked if something had happened, and she said they'd opened an investigation into harassment complaints at the store. Apparently, there were complaints involving both Lionel and Mia, who had gotten herself hired there a few weeks back. Sylvia sounded tired when she talked, like she'd been dealing with this mess for a while already. She said she needed to interview both of them separately and was implementing schedule changes to keep them apart during shifts. The problem was that the situation was way more complicated than a normal workplace harassment case. She had old complaints about Lionel from customers and new complaints about Mia from Lionel, and now Mia was claiming that Lionel was the one harassing her by trying to get her fired. Sylvia asked if I knew anything about their history outside of work. I gave her a basic overview without mentioning my role in starting the whole thing. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch if she needed more information. That evening, I was scrolling through my phone when a notification popped up. Madison had sent me a direct message on social media. I stared at it for a minute before opening it. Her message was calm and straightforward. She said she'd heard through some mutual connections about what was happening with Lionel and Mia. She asked if I understood now what Lionel had put her and other women through. She wanted to know if I thought he'd learned anything from experiencing it himself. The message wasn't mean or angry, just pointed. She was asking real questions, and I knew she deserved real answers. I started typing a response 3 different times and deleted all of them. The honest answer was that Lionel hadn't learned anything at all. He still thought what he'd done to Madison and the others was completely different from what Mia was doing to him. In his mind, those women had secretly enjoyed the attention while he was a genuine victim. I didn't know how to explain that to Madison without sounding like I was making excuses for him. I finally sent Madison a message back later that night. I apologized for not taking what happened to her seriously enough when it was happening. I admitted that Lionel still didn't see any connection between his own behavior and what he was going through now. I told her I was sorry for thinking this experiment would teach him empathy when all it did was make him feel victimized. Madison responded pretty quickly. She said she appreciated the apology, but that words didn't really fix anything. Then she asked if I'd be willing to come to a support group meeting. She said it was for people who'd dealt with stalking and harassment, and that maybe hearing other people's stories would help me understand what I'd missed before. She sent me the address and meeting time. I looked at the message for a long time before responding. Part of me didn't want to go because I knew it would be uncomfortable, but I also knew I needed to hear those stories and understand the real damage this kind of behavior caused. I sent back a message saying I'd be there. Powell called me 2 days later. He said he'd been keeping an eye on the situation and wanted to give me some advice to pass along to Lionel. He recommended some practical security steps that Lionel should take right away, regardless of whether he filed any official reports. Powell said Lionel needed to change his daily routines and vary his routes to work. He should check his car for tracking devices, especially under the wheel wells and bumpers where they're easy to hide. He suggested installing security cameras at home, the kind that record to the cloud so the footage can't be destroyed if someone breaks in. Powell also said Lionel should tell his neighbors and co-workers what was going on, so they could be extra eyes watching for Mia. I wrote all this down and called Lionel right after I hung up with Powell. For once, Lionel actually listened without arguing. I think he was finally scared enough to take the threat seriously. He said he'd order cameras that day and start changing his routine. He also said he'd been thinking about moving to a new apartment, but wasn't sure if he could afford it right now. 3 days later, Lionel called me from a car repair shop. His voice sounded weird, kind of shaky, but also excited. He said he'd taken his car in for an oil change, and the technician had found something stuck under the frame. It was a GPS tracker, the kind you can buy online for a couple $100. The technician's name was Glenn, and he'd helped Lionel document everything with photos before removing the device. Glenn took pictures of where it was mounted, close-ups of the serial number, and shots of it next to Lionel's car for reference. Lionel said this was the first real evidence that Mia had crossed into clearly illegal territory. Up until now, everything she'd done had been technically legal, just creepy and persistent. But putting a tracking device on someone's car without permission was a crime. Lionel said he was finally ready to file a police report and start the restraining order process. I could hear his hands shaking as he talked about filling out the paperwork. I told him I'd meet him at the police station and we could do it together. He agreed and gave me the address. Powell took Lionel's statement at the station and collected the GPS tracker as evidence. He said this gave him enough to open an official investigation into Mia's stalking behavior. He'd interview Lionel formally first and then contact Mia to get her statement. Powell warned us that Mia would probably deny everything and try to flip the script somehow. He was right. When Powell called Mia in for questioning, she denied placing any tracker on Lionel's car. She suggested that Lionel had put it there himself to frame her because he was mentally unstable and paranoid. She said he'd been acting erratically at work and making up stories about her following him. She claimed she barely knew him and that his obsession with her was making her uncomfortable. Powell said it was exactly the defense he'd expected. She was sophisticated enough to know how to muddy the waters and create reasonable doubt. But the tracker itself was physical evidence, and the serial number could potentially be traced back to a purchase. Powell said he'd keep investigating and building the case. In the meantime, Lionel should move forward with the civil restraining order because that had a lower burden of proof than criminal charges. Aisha met with us at her office to help Lionel prepare the civil restraining order petition. We spent the whole afternoon organizing his documentation into a timeline with evidence attached to each incident. Lionel had screenshots of hundreds of texts, photos of Mia at his workplace and gym, witness statements from neighbors about the 3 a.m. music incidents, and now the GPS tracker. Aisha helped him write descriptions of each event in clear, factual language that would work in court. I watched Lionel relive every incident as he wrote them down. His hands would start shaking when he described certain things, like waking up to find Mia had been in his bedroom taking photos. For a few brief moments while we worked, I thought maybe he was starting to understand how traumatic this kind of attention really was. But then he'd make comments about how his past situations with women were totally different because those girls had secretly enjoyed it. He'd say things like how Madison smiled at work the next day, so she must have liked the attention deep down. Aisha would give me these looks across the table, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I just shook my head. There was no point arguing with him about it anymore. The support group met in a church basement on Thursday evenings. I showed up 15 minutes early and sat in my car trying to decide if I really wanted to go in. Madison's car pulled up next to mine and she waved. We walked in together. There were about 12 people sitting in a circle of folding chairs. The group leader introduced me as a friend of Madison's, and everyone welcomed me. Then people started sharing their stories. One woman talked about being followed home from work every night for 3 months. A man described receiving hundreds of texts and calls from someone who wouldn't accept that he wasn't interested. Another woman explained how her ex-boyfriend knew her schedule so perfectly that he'd show up everywhere she went, making it impossible to feel safe anywhere. Every single story sounded exactly like what Lionel was going through with Mia right now, but they also sounded exactly like what Lionel had done to Madison and the dental hygienist and those customers at his work. The parallels were so clear and obvious that I felt sick listening to them. One woman described how her stalker claimed to love her and couldn't understand why she didn't appreciate his devotion. She said he'd tell people that she was playing hard to get and that she secretly enjoyed the attention. That was literally word for word what Lionel said about the women he'd harassed. I sat there feeling guilt twist in my stomach as I realized I'd helped create another victim instead of teaching anyone a lesson. I thought making Lionel experience this would give him empathy, but all it did was traumatize him while leaving him completely blind to his own behavior. Another woman started talking about how her ex showed up everywhere she went, at her gym and her grocery store, and even her church, always saying it was just a coincidence. But she knew he was tracking her somehow. A man described getting hundreds of messages saying things like, "We're meant to be together," and "You'll understand eventually," even after he blocked the person on every platform. Someone else talked about their stalker sitting outside their house at night, just watching, making them feel unsafe in their own home. Every single story matched what was happening to Lionel right now, but they also matched exactly what Lionel had done to other women. The dental hygienist story was almost word for word what one woman described about her stalker camping outside her apartment. Madison's parking lot experience sounded just like what another person went through with someone cornering them after work. Requested Reds is on Spotify now, Check out link in the description or comments. I sat there feeling worse and worse as each person shared, because I'd helped do this to Lionel thinking it would teach him something, but all I'd done was create another victim, while he learned nothing. Madison and I went to a coffee shop after the group ended. She ordered a latte while I just got water because my stomach felt too twisted to drink anything. We sat by the window, and she asked what I planned to do now to fix this mess. I told her I honestly didn't know, because Mia seemed impossible to stop, and Lionel still refused to see any connection between what he was experiencing and what he'd done to women. Madison stirred her coffee and said the best thing I could do was support the legal process. Make sure Lionel got into therapy, whether he thought he needed it or not, and stop waiting for some big moment where he suddenly understood everything. She said, most people who do what Lionel did never really get it. They just learn to hide it better, or face enough consequences that they stop. I asked if she thought the restraining order would actually help, and she said maybe. But the real question was whether I'd testify if she and the other women decided to take legal action against Lionel for what he'd done to them. I said yes, without even thinking about it, which surprised both of us. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse waiting room with Lionel for his temporary restraining order hearing. We hadn't talked much since I agreed to testify for Madison, and he kept his distance from me even in the small waiting area. Aisha showed up to help him prepare and went over his evidence one more time. When the judge called the case, we all walked into the courtroom, and Lionel took the witness stand. He presented the GPS tracker that Glenn had found under his car, along with photos showing where it had been attached. He showed screenshots of the 200 texts Mia sent in one night, all time-stamped and saved. He had photos of Mia at his workplace and at his gym, taken by co-workers and other gym members who'd witnessed her following him around. The neighbors provided written statements about the 3 a.m. incidents with the Bluetooth speaker, including noise complaints they'd filed with police. Lionel's hands shook while he talked, and his voice cracked when he described checking his back seat before getting in his car every single time now. The judge listened carefully and asked specific questions about when Lionel had told Mia he wasn't interested and whether there was any evidence he'd encouraged her attention. Lionel's lawyer showed text messages where Lionel clearly said, "Leave me alone," and "Stop contacting me," dozens of times. The judge reviewed everything for about 10 minutes, then granted a temporary restraining order valid until the full hearing in 3 weeks. Mia hadn't shown up to the hearing, which Aisha said afterward was pretty common because people don't take the temporary orders seriously. The order said Mia couldn't contact Lionel in any way, couldn't come within 500 feet of him, and couldn't go to his home or workplace. Powell met us outside the courtroom and warned that the real test would be whether Mia violated the order, because enforcement only worked if she broke it and got caught doing it. He said to document everything and call police immediately if she showed up anywhere near Lionel. I asked what would happen if she violated it, and Powell said she'd be arrested and charged with a crime, which might finally make her understand this was serious. Lionel looked relieved leaving the courthouse, like he could finally breathe a little bit. For about a week after the temporary order got granted, nothing happened. Mia didn't text or call or show up anywhere. Lionel started sleeping in his own bed again instead of his car, though he still checked the security cameras on his phone about 50 times a day. He went to work and the gym without seeing her there. The neighbors didn't report any more 3 a.m. incidents. Lionel's hands still shook, and he still looked over his shoulder constantly, but the actual harassment had stopped. I started hoping that maybe the legal intervention had scared Mia enough to back off, or that seeing the inside of a courtroom had broken through whatever obsession was driving her. Lionel even smiled a couple times that week, which I hadn't seen him do in months. Then, Mia created 3 new social media accounts and started posting constantly about soulmates and destiny and true love that overcomes all obstacles. She never mentioned Lionel by name, but she posted details that anyone who knew the situation would recognize. She talked about a man who was 6'3" and worked in retail and went to a specific gym. She posted about wedding planning for next June and shared photos of the venue she'd picked. She also started having her friends contact Lionel with messages like, "Mia wanted me to tell you she's thinking about you," and "Mia says she knows you'll come around eventually." Her friends would show up at places Lionel went and mention that Mia had told them to say hi. The harassment continued, but now it was technically legal because Mia herself wasn't making direct contact. Powell explained when I called him that this kind of proxy harassment was super common and really hard to do anything about. Mia could claim she was just living her life and posting on her own social media, and she couldn't control what her friends chose to do on their own. He said courts rarely found this kind of thing to be a violation unless there was clear proof Mia was directing her friends to contact Lionel. Powell documented everything anyway, saving screenshots and taking statements from Lionel about the friend contacts, building a pattern of behavior case that might be useful later. I asked why the legal system couldn't do more, and Powell said stalking laws were written before social media existed, so there were all these gaps that stalkers had learned to use. He said lots of stalking victims had restraining orders that didn't actually stop the harassment, they just changed how it happened. Lionel almost messed everything up when one of Mia's friends sent him a message saying Mia missed him and wanted to talk. He typed out an angry response telling the friend to leave him alone and was about to hit send when I saw his phone screen and grabbed it from him. I explained that any contact from him, even telling them to stop, could be used as evidence that he was engaging with Mia and wanted the communication. The restraining order said no contact, which meant he couldn't respond to her or anyone acting on her behalf, not even to tell them to go away. Lionel got really mad and said he felt trapped, unable to even defend himself or tell people to stop bothering him. He said it wasn't fair that Mia could have her friends harass him, but he couldn't even respond. I told him that's exactly how Madison probably felt when he followed her, and she couldn't make him stop, but Lionel just walked away from that conversation. Sylvia called me from Lionel's work because I was listed as his emergency contact. She said she'd finished the investigation into the harassment complaints and had some results she needed to discuss. She'd found 4 separate written complaints from female customers about Lionel making unwanted advances and following them through the store. 2 customers had complained to managers about him asking for their phone numbers after they'd said no. One woman had filed a complaint about Lionel waiting by her car in the parking lot. Another customer said Lionel had found her on social media after she shopped at the store and sent her messages. Sylvia also confirmed that Mia had violated workplace harassment rules by pursuing Lionel at work, even after he'd clearly rejected her and asked her to stop. She said company policy required her to take action on both sets of findings, which meant there would be consequences for both Lionel and Mia, regardless of what happened with the criminal case. The next day, Sylvia called again and asked me to come to the store to pick up some of Lionel's things. She said the company was ending his employment because of the pattern of customer complaints and the risk he created for the business. She sounded genuinely sorry about it and said Lionel would get severance pay and the termination would be listed as a policy violation instead of being fired for cause, which would help him find another job. But the documentation of his behavior toward customers was too much for the company to ignore, especially now that it was all written down in an official investigation. Sylvia said Mia was also being fired for harassment and for violating the restraining order by being at Lionel's workplace. I asked how Lionel had reacted to the news, and Sylvia said he'd been really upset and had left the building right away. I drove to the store to get his belongings from his locker and found him sitting in his car in the parking lot, crying. That afternoon, Sylvia called me again and said she needed to update me on the investigation results for Mia. She explained that the company was ending Mia's employment too because of the harassment complaints and the restraining order violation from being at Lionel's workplace. I asked how Mia reacted to being fired, and Sylvia paused before saying Mia had taken the news really calmly and had actually smiled when she signed the termination papers. Sylvia said it creeped her out because most people get upset or angry when they lose their job, but Mia acted like it was no big deal, or maybe even something she wanted. I got this sick feeling in my stomach because it seemed like Mia saw getting fired as some kind of romantic thing she was doing for Lionel, like she was making a big sacrifice to prove her love instead of facing the fact that she'd broken the law. Sylvia said she wanted me to know because it showed Mia wasn't thinking normally about the situation, and that worried her from a safety standpoint. I thanked her for calling and sat there trying to figure out what to do with this information when my phone rang again and I saw it was Luke calling. I answered, and he immediately started yelling at me about how I was destroying Lionel's life by getting the police and HR involved in everything. He said I should have just told Lionel to change his phone number and move on instead of making everything into this huge legal mess with restraining orders and investigations. I tried to explain that Lionel had tried ignoring Mia for weeks, and it only made things worse because she escalated her behavior every time he didn't respond. Luke cut me off and said that was because Lionel wasn't firm enough with her and probably gave her mixed signals that made her think she had a chance. I felt my jaw clench because Luke was doing exactly what he'd done when Lionel harassed those other women, making excuses and blaming the victim instead of holding Lionel accountable. I asked Luke if he remembered how Madison filed a restraining order against Lionel, or how the dental hygienist had to move to a different city to get away from him. Luke's voice got louder, and he said that was completely different because Lionel was genuinely interested in those women and was just being persistent, not threatening like Mia. He said men pursuing women they like is normal and romantic, but what Mia was doing was actual stalking because she was a woman chasing a man who clearly wasn't interested. I pointed out that Madison had clearly said no to Lionel multiple times, and he still followed her home and waited by her car, which is exactly what Mia did to him. Luke said, I didn't understand how dating works, and that women expect men to pursue them even when they say no, because that's how you show you're serious about someone. I realized right then that Luke's attitude was probably where Lionel learned this behavior was okay, and that whole generations of men in my family had been taught that ignoring women's boundaries was romantic instead of scary. Luke kept going on about how I was being dramatic and ruining Lionel's reputation by making him look weak for filing complaints against a woman. I told him that everyone deserves safety regardless of their gender, and that Lionel's past behavior doesn't mean he deserves to be stalked now. Luke said I was choosing strangers over my own brother, and hung up on me before I could respond. I sat there shaking with anger and frustration, because I finally understood that Luke would never see the problem with what Lionel did to those women. My phone buzzed with a message from Madison, and when I opened it, I saw she'd forwarded me a screenshot of a message Lionel had sent her 2 days ago. The message said he wanted to apologize for any misunderstanding about what happened in the parking lot, but that she'd overreacted because he was just trying to talk to her and get to know her better. He wrote that he never meant to scare her, and she should have just been honest about her feelings, instead of running away and filing legal complaints. Madison's message to me said she wanted me to see that my brother still didn't understand what he did wrong, even while he was going through the exact same thing with Mia. She said Lionel would probably never learn, because guys like him truly believe women secretly want to be chased and cornered, and that any fear they show is just playing hard to get. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling sick because she was right, and all of this had been for nothing if Lionel couldn't see the connection between his actions and Mia's. 3 weeks later, I went with Lionel to the courthouse for the permanent restraining order hearing, and this time Mia showed up with an actual lawyer sitting next to her. Her lawyer stood up and argued that Lionel was making normal romantic interest sound dangerous, and that he'd initially encouraged Mia's attention before suddenly changing his mind and claiming he felt threatened. The lawyer said Mia was a graduate student with no criminal history who simply developed feelings for someone and expressed those feelings in ways that might have been intense but weren't illegal. Mia took the stand and testified in this really calm voice about how she cared deeply for Lionel and couldn't understand why expressing love had become something criminal in our society. She said Lionel had smiled at her at work and talked to her about his life, which made her think he was interested, and now he was painting her as some kind of dangerous person just because his feelings changed. She looked right at Lionel while she talked and said she understood he was confused right now, but that she believed time would help him see they were meant to be together. I watched the judge's face and couldn't tell what he was thinking, while Mia made herself sound like a victim of mixed signals instead of someone who'd been stalking Lionel for months. Then Lionel's lawyer stood up and started presenting all the evidence we'd collected, including photos of the GPS tracker that had been stuck to Lionel's car. He showed the judge printed copies of the hundreds of texts Mia had sent in single nights, and the witness statements from neighbors who'd called the cops when she showed up at 3 a.m. He had statements from people at Lionel's gym who saw Mia following him around, and from co-workers who witnessed her cornering him at work even after he'd asked her to leave him alone. The lawyer pulled up the documentation, showing Mia had gotten herself hired at Lionel's workplace, specifically to be near him, and had violated company harassment policies repeatedly. The judge looked through everything carefully, and then asked Mia directly if she understood that Lionel did not want any contact with her of any kind. Mia nodded and said yes. She understood his current position, but that she believed his feelings would change with time and patience. The judge's expression shifted, and he said that wasn't the question, asking again if she understood that Lionel wanted no contact now or in the future, regardless of whether his feelings might theoretically change. Mia said she understood what Lionel was saying now, but that love was patient, and she was willing to wait for him to realize what they had together. I saw the judge write something down and knew that answer hadn't helped her case at all. The judge announced he was granting a 1-year restraining order and started explaining in really serious language that any violation would result in immediate criminal charges and possible jail time. He said Mia was prohibited from any contact with Lionel, whether direct or through other people, and that she couldn't go anywhere near his home, workplace, or any place she knew he'd be. Then the judge looked at Lionel and said something I didn't expect, pointing out that Lionel had his own history of harassment complaints from multiple women and that he should understand better than anyone why this kind of behavior was unacceptable. Lionel's face went bright red, and I could see people in the courtroom looking at him while the judge talked about how experiencing unwanted pursuit should teach him empathy for his own past victims. The judge said he was granting the order to protect Lionel, but hoped this experience would make him reflect on his own actions toward women who'd told him no. After the hearing ended, Aisha pulled me aside in the hallway and said she needed to warn me about something important. She explained that restraining orders sometimes make stalkers escalate instead of stopping because they see the legal intervention as proof that their target is being kept from them unfairly. She said I needed to prepare for the possibility that Mia would get worse instead of better, and gave me a whole packet of safety planning materials. Aisha suggested that Lionel should think about staying somewhere else temporarily at an address Mia didn't know, because the first few weeks after a restraining order gets granted can be the most dangerous time. I took the materials and felt my hands shaking, because the idea that this might get worse after we'd gone through the whole legal process was really scary. That night, I got home around 9 and found a thick white binder sitting on my doorstep with a ribbon tied around it. I picked it up and opened it to find detailed wedding plans for a ceremony between Mia and Lionel, scheduled for next June at the venue she'd mentioned. The binder had everything, including a guest list with my name on it listed as brother of the groom and a seating chart showing where everyone would sit. There were fabric samples for bridesmaid dresses and menu options for the reception dinner and a timeline for the whole day. The worst part was finding a section filled with photos that Mia had photoshopped to make it look like she and Lionel were a couple. Pictures of them together that had never actually happened, but looked almost real. She'd created this whole fake history of their relationship with images of them at restaurants and parks and holding hands, building a fantasy world where they were already together. I immediately took photos of every page with my phone and noted the exact time I found the binder and where it had been left. Then I called Powell and reported that Mia had violated the restraining order that had been granted just hours earlier by leaving this at my house. Powell said he'd come right over to collect it as evidence and told me not to touch it any more than I already had in case they could get fingerprints off it. He arrived 20 minutes later wearing gloves and carefully bagged the binder while asking me questions about exactly when I'd found it and if I'd seen anyone near my house. Powell looked through the photos I'd taken on my phone and said this would definitely result in criminal charges against Mia for violating the protective order so quickly after it was issued. He seemed genuinely worried about the escalation pattern and said the fact that she'd targeted me now instead of just Lionel showed she was expanding her focus in dangerous ways. Powell recommended I file for my own restraining order against Mia, since she was clearly willing to involve me in her obsession with Lionel. I agreed to file one and felt this cold realization that my involvement in starting this whole thing had made me a target too, that I wasn't just watching this situation anymore, but was actually part of it now. I watched Powell's car pull away with the binder secured in evidence bags, then went back inside and locked every door and window in my apartment. My phone buzzed with a text from Lionel asking if he could stay over tonight because he didn't feel safe at his place anymore. I told him yes, and started clearing space in my guest room, moving boxes and setting up the pull-out couch, while my hands still shook from finding that wedding binder on my doorstep. Lionel arrived an hour later carrying a duffel bag and his laptop, his eyes scanning the parking lot behind him 3 times before he walked to my door. He came inside and immediately checked all my windows to make sure they were locked, then asked if I had security cameras like he'd installed at his apartment. I showed him the doorbell camera I'd put up last week, and he nodded but didn't look reassured, setting his bag down in the guest room before sitting on my couch with his phone gripped in both hands. Over the next week, Mia's social media filled with cryptic posts about obstacles that test true love and how real connections survive any challenge. She posted quotes about destiny and soulmates, never mentioning Lionel by name, but including enough details that anyone following the situation would know exactly who she meant. Her lawyer would later argue these posts weren't about Lionel specifically and were just general thoughts about relationships, but everyone who read them understood the message she was sending. She posted photos of wedding venues with captions about dreams coming true and patience being rewarded, building this public narrative of their future together that existed only in her head. Then flowers arrived at our mom's house with a card signed, "Your future daughter-in-law," and I got the call from my mom sobbing into the phone about how this crazy woman knew where she lived. Mom said she'd thrown the flowers in the trash immediately, but kept the card to show the police, her voice shaking as she described opening the door to find the delivery sitting on her porch. I drove over to pick up the card and take photos of it for evidence, finding my mom sitting at her kitchen table looking exhausted and scared. She asked me how this had gotten so out of control and why Mia was dragging the whole family into her obsession with Lionel. I didn't have a good answer because I was still trying to understand it myself, this escalation that kept expanding to include more people in ways I'd never anticipated. Lionel moved in with me after that incident with our mom, too scared to stay at his apartment alone now that Mia had proven she'd target family members. He brought more of his stuff over the next day, including all his security camera equipment, setting up monitors in my living room so he could watch feeds from both his apartment and my place simultaneously. Living with him meant seeing up close how damaged he'd become from months of Mia's stalking, watching him jump at every noise and check the camera feeds obsessively every few minutes. He barely slept more than 3 or 4 hours a night, lying awake in the guest room scrolling through his phone, checking for new messages or posts from Mia. I'd hear him get up multiple times during the night to look out windows or check that doors were still locked, his footsteps creaking across my apartment at 2 or 3 in the morning. During the day, he'd sit on my couch staring at his phone, his leg bouncing constantly with nervous energy, and his hands shaking whenever he got a notification. He'd lost more weight since I'd seen him last week, his face looking hollow and his clothes hanging loose on his frame. I tried to get him to eat regular meals, but he'd pick at food without really consuming much, his appetite gone from constant stress and fear. What frustrated me most was watching him talk about his experience without ever connecting it to what he'd done to Madison and the others. He'd describe feeling trapped and monitored, how Mia seemed to know his schedule and show up everywhere he went, how he couldn't escape her attention no matter what he did. Then, in the same conversation, he'd mentioned that Madison had been dramatic about the parking lot incident because he was just trying to talk to her and she'd overreacted. I'd point out the parallel, and he'd get defensive, insisting his situations with women had been completely different because he genuinely cared about them while Mia was just obsessed and dangerous. He couldn't or wouldn't see that the women he'd stalked had felt exactly what he was feeling now, that same sense of being hunted and having no control over when your stalker would appear. Living with him meant witnessing this inability to make the connection, despite experiencing the terror firsthand, and it was both frustrating and sad, watching him suffer without gaining any real understanding. I'd lie awake at night in my own room listening to him pace in the guest room, knowing he was genuinely traumatized, but also knowing his own victims had probably spent nights exactly like this because of him. Powell called 3 days after Lionel moved in to say the district attorney had reviewed the evidence and decided to prosecute Mia for stalking and violating the restraining order. He said we needed to come down to the prosecutor's office to meet with the attorney handling the case and go over what to expect at trial. We drove to the courthouse the next morning and met with a prosecutor named Sarah Chen, who looked about 40 with reading glasses and a folder thick with documentation about Mia's behavior. She spread out photos and printouts across the conference table showing the GPS tracker, screenshots of texts, witness statements, and copies of the restraining order Mia had violated. She explained that stalking cases were hard to win because juries sometimes sympathized with defendants who claimed they were just expressing love or romantic interest, especially when the stalker was an educated woman who didn't fit people's stereotypes. She said prosecutors had to prove the behavior would cause a reasonable person to feel fear, which defense attorneys often challenged by arguing the victim was overreacting or misinterpreting innocent actions. But she felt confident about our case because the GPS tracker was hard evidence of illegal monitoring, and the restraining order violation showed Mia had been explicitly told to stop, but continued anyway. She walked us through the trial timeline and what Lionel would need to testify about, how he'd have to describe the impact on his daily life and mental health. Lionel listened quietly and asked questions about whether Mia would be in the courtroom and if she could contact him during the trial process. Sarah said Mia would be present for trial, but the existing restraining order remained in effect, and any violation would result in immediate arrest. During this time, I started drafting an apology letter to Madison, sitting at my laptop late at night while Lionel slept fitfully in the guest room. I wrote about how I hadn't taken her experience with Lionel seriously enough, and how I now understood the real trauma that stalking causes after watching what it did to my brother. I explained that I'd been wrong to think teaching Lionel a lesson through experiencing it himself would create empathy or change, that all it did was create another victim without making him understand what he'd done to others. I wrote several versions over multiple nights, trying to find words that expressed genuine remorse without making excuses for my role in dismissing what she'd been through. But every version I wrote felt wrong somehow, like I was trying to make myself feel better rather than truly making amends to her. I realized she didn't owe me forgiveness, and my apology might actually be more burden than help, forcing her to respond or process my guilt when she'd already dealt with enough. I deleted all the drafts and instead texted Aisha, asking if there were concrete ways I could support stalking victims beyond just words and apologies that might be more about my own feelings than helping anyone. Aisha called me back the same day and said she worked with a local organization that provided safety resources for stalking victims, and they always needed volunteers for their documentation workshops. She explained that many victims didn't know how to preserve evidence or what kind of documentation would help with restraining orders and criminal cases, so the organization taught practical skills about taking screenshots, keeping timelines, and organizing evidence for legal proceedings. She said, if I wanted to do something useful with what I'd learned from Lionel's situation, teaching others how to protect themselves would be more valuable than apologies. I signed up to volunteer the next week and attended a training session where they taught me their curriculum about evidence preservation and legal options. The work felt small but concrete, something I could actually do instead of just feeling guilty about my role in starting this whole mess. My first workshop had 6 people who'd experienced various forms of stalking and harassment, and I helped them organize their documentation into formats that would work for restraining order petitions. Every person I met reminded me of what I'd helped inflict on Lionel, even though his own victims deserved this same support. And the work was humbling in a way that forced me to confront my own failures more directly than just writing apology letters to myself. 2 weeks after the prosecutor decided to move forward with charges, Mia's lawyer contacted Powell about a possible plea deal. The lawyer proposed that Mia would plead guilty to a lesser charge of harassment instead of stalking in exchange for probation and mandatory counseling rather than potential jail time. Powell called to explain that the prosecutor was willing to consider it because plea deals guaranteed some consequence without the uncertainty of a trial, where juries could be unpredictable, especially in cases involving educated defendants who presented well in court. But Lionel had to agree to the deal since he was the victim, and the prosecutor wouldn't accept it without his consent. Powell said we should think carefully about what outcome we wanted, whether the goal was punishment or just getting Mia into treatment and under supervision. Lionel sat at my kitchen table after the call, turning his phone over and over in his hands, conflicted between wanting this whole thing over quickly and wanting Mia to face the maximum penalties possible. He asked me what I thought he should do, and I told him honestly that I couldn't make that decision for him, that both options had trade-offs, and he needed to decide what felt right. He spent days going back and forth, calling Powell with questions about what probation would actually mean and whether the mandatory counseling would really change anything about Mia's behavior. Before Lionel made his decision about the plea deal, Mia violated the restraining order again. Lionel had gone to the grocery store near my apartment to pick up food for dinner, and I stayed home working on my laptop when he called me from the produce section. His voice was shaking as he said Mia was there walking toward him and he didn't know what to do. I told him to call 911 immediately and stay in a public area with other people around, hearing him tell the dispatcher his location while I grabbed my keys to drive over. He stayed on the phone with me after calling the police, describing how Mia had approached him calmly and told him she knew he still cared about her, and this legal situation was just temporary drama they'd laugh about later. She'd reached out to touch his arm, and he'd backed away, knocking over a display of apples while other shoppers stared. He'd managed to keep his phone out and recording video while backing toward the front of the store, Mia following him and talking about how they were meant to be together. The police arrived within 5 minutes and found them near the checkout lanes, Mia still trying to talk to Lionel while he stood behind a shopping cart like a barrier. I got there just as they were arresting her, watching officers put her in handcuffs while she insisted calmly that she hadn't done anything wrong and was just shopping at the same store. Lionel was shaking so hard he could barely stand, and I drove him back to my apartment where he sat on the couch, staring at nothing for an hour. Mia's arrest for violating the restraining order made the plea deal irrelevant, because now the prosecutor had an even stronger case with a witnessed violation and police response. Powell called that evening to say Mia had been held overnight and would be arraigned the next morning on the new violation charge. The judge set bail, but added GPS monitoring as a condition of release, which meant Mia would have to wear an ankle monitor that tracked her location and would alert authorities if she came near Lionel's home or workplace. Powell said this was the first real consequence that might actually limit her behavior, since she'd been so careful before to stay technically legal while still maintaining psychological pressure. The ankle monitor felt like something concrete finally, a technological enforcement of the court orders that didn't rely on Mia choosing to comply. Sarah Chen called later to say she was moving forward with the full stalking case, and the new violation strengthened everything significantly, making it much harder for Mia's lawyer to argue she was just misunderstood or that Lionel was overreacting. With Mia on GPS monitoring, Lionel felt safe enough to move back to his own apartment after staying with me for 3 weeks. He kept all the security cameras installed and said he'd continue changing his routines regularly, varying his routes to work and the times he went places. He'd gotten a job offer from a different retail store across town, and one of the conditions was that he attend therapy, which the manager had made clear was mandatory given his history and the current situation. Lionel agreed and started seeing a therapist twice a week, though when he described the sessions to me, I suspected he wasn't being fully honest about his own past behavior toward women. He'd mentioned talking about Mia's stalking and the trauma it caused, but never brought up Madison or the dental hygienist or the customer complaints from his old job. I didn't push him on it, because at least he was going to therapy at all, and maybe over time he'd get to a place where he could actually address the parallels. Small steps felt like all we could hope for at this point, knowing that real change would take years if it happened at all. The prosecutor moved forward with the stalking case, and trial was scheduled for 2 months out. In the meantime, Mia's GPS monitoring showed she was staying away from Lionel's apartment and his new workplace, the ankle bracelet tracking her movements and confirming she wasn't violating the restraining order physically. But she kept posting on social media about connections that transcend physical distance and bonds that couldn't be broken by legal documents, never mentioning Lionel by name, but clearly still focused on their supposed relationship. Her lawyer argued the social media posts were protected free speech and didn't violate the restraining order since they weren't direct contact or threats, which was technically true, but felt like continued harassment psychologically. Sarah said they were documenting all the posts anyway to show the pattern of obsessive behavior, building the case that Mia's focus on Lionel was persistent and unwavering despite multiple legal interventions. Powell checked in weekly to make sure Lionel felt safe and to review any new incidents, but the GPS monitoring seemed to be working as a deterrent to physical stalking, even if it couldn't stop the online behavior. Lionel still checked his security cameras constantly and jumped at unexpected noises, but he was sleeping better and had started eating regular meals again. The visible improvement made me hope that maybe we were finally moving toward some kind of resolution, even though I knew the trial ahead would bring everything back to the surface. The next Tuesday, I walked into the support group meeting and sat in the circle of folding chairs, my hands sweating while I waited for my turn to share. When Madison nodded at me, I started talking about how I'd set up the whole experiment with Mia to teach Lionel a lesson, how it spiraled into real stalking, how I'd created another victim while thinking I was doing something good. A woman named Jennifer interrupted to ask if I thought stalking was a game, her voice getting louder as she described her own stalker who'd started as someone's idea of justice, too. Another person said they appreciated my honesty and that at least I was trying to make things right now instead of pretending it never happened. The group argued about whether I deserved to be there or if I was just making their space about my guilt, and I sat there taking it because they were right to be angry. Madison spoke up and said she was glad I was taking responsibility, but that the real test was whether I'd do anything concrete to help Lionel's other victims get acknowledgement for what he did to them. She said words were easy, but action was what mattered, and I needed to decide if I was serious about accountability or just wanted to feel better about myself. After the meeting ended, I asked Madison if we could talk privately, and we walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks away. I asked her what real accountability would look like for Lionel beyond the job loss and therapy he was already doing. She stirred her coffee and said she'd been talking to 2 other women Lionel had harassed, the dental hygienist and a former coworker, and they were thinking about filing a civil suit for emotional distress. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about his pattern of behavior and the things he'd admitted to me about following women and ignoring their rejections. I said yes immediately, without even thinking about it, knowing it would destroy whatever was left of my relationship with Lionel and probably get me cut off from Luke too. Madison watched my face and said she could tell I understood what I was agreeing to, that this wasn't going to be easy or make anyone like me better, but that her and the other women deserved some kind of formal acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. I told her I'd write down everything I remembered and every conversation where Lionel had bragged about his tactics or dismissed women's fear as playing hard to get. We exchanged numbers, and she said her lawyer would contact me once they decided to move forward with the filing. That night I drove to Lionel's apartment to tell him about agreeing to testify before he heard it from someone else. He was eating dinner in front of the TV when I arrived, and his face went hard when I explained what Madison had asked and what I'd agreed to do. He stood up fast enough that his plate crashed to the floor and started yelling that I was betraying family for people who didn't matter, that blood was supposed to mean something. I tried to explain that his victims deserved acknowledgement and consequences, just like he'd deserved protection from Mia, that the situations were parallel, even if he couldn't see it. Lionel grabbed his keys and told me to get out, that I was dead to him if I testified against him in any legal proceeding. I said I hoped someday he'd understand that real family support meant holding each other accountable instead of covering up harm, but he just opened the door and stood there waiting for me to leave. I walked out, knowing our relationship was probably broken beyond repair, and that I had to accept that outcome as part of making things right. The next morning, Luke called me at work, and I could hear the anger in his voice before he even said hello. He told me I was no longer welcome at family gatherings if I was going to testify against Lionel, that I was choosing strangers over my own brother. I said that enabling Lionel's behavior for years was what created this whole situation in the first place, that Luke's attitude of dismissing stalking as flattery had taught Lionel that his actions were acceptable. Luke said I was being dramatic, and that boys will be boys, that Lionel never meant any harm, and those women should have been clearer about their boundaries. I told him that's exactly the problem. That mindset where women's fear doesn't count as a clear boundary, where following someone home is just persistence instead of threatening. He said I'd made my choice and hung up on me before I could say anything else. 3 weeks later, the prosecutor called to say Mia's trial date was set for 2 months out, and she felt confident about getting a conviction based on the GPS tracker evidence, the documented restraining order violations, and witness testimony from me and the neighbors and Glenn from the oil change place. She said Lionel would need to testify about the impact of Mia's stalking and describe specific incidents for the jury. His therapist was helping him prepare for that, working through the anxiety of having to speak in court and relive the worst moments. The prosecutor added that I was listed as a witness too, since I'd observed many of the incidents firsthand and had documentation of Mia's escalation from experiment to obsession. She sent me a packet of information about what to expect as a witness and how to prepare my testimony. The week before trial was supposed to start, Mia's lawyer contacted the prosecutor with a final plea offer. Mia would accept a guilty plea to stalking and violating a protective order in exchange for a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation with mandatory mental health treatment. The prosecutor called Lionel to explain that the plea deal would guarantee consequences and monitoring without the stress of trial testimony, and she recommended accepting it because trials were unpredictable, and this ensured Mia would have supervision. Lionel talked it over with his therapist and Aisha, and finally agreed to accept the plea deal, signing the paperwork that afternoon. The plea hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in a small courtroom with just the lawyers and us and the judge. Mia stood at the defendant's table in a gray suit and pleaded guilty to stalking and violating a protective order in a flat voice that showed no emotion at all. The judge asked if she understood the charges and the consequences, and she said yes in that same empty tone that was somehow worse than her previous intensity had been. The judge accepted her plea and imposed the agreed sentence, which was 2 years of suspended jail time, 3 years of supervised probation, mandatory mental health treatment twice a week, and a permanent restraining order that would stay in effect even after probation ended. Mia nodded when asked if she understood the terms, and her lawyer led her out of the courtroom without her looking at any of us. After the hearing, Lionel seemed lighter somehow, like he could finally breathe, knowing there were official consequences in place and someone monitoring Mia's behavior. He got hired at a new retail store a few weeks later, after being honest in the interview about being in therapy and working on professional boundaries. I wanted to believe he was learning something real from all this, but his comments still suggested he saw himself purely as a victim rather than someone who'd also caused harm to others. Madison called me 6 weeks after Mia's sentencing to say she and the other women had decided to move forward with the civil suit against Lionel. I met with their lawyer and provided a detailed written statement about his pattern of behavior, including specific things he'd said about following Madison to her car and sitting outside the dental hygienist's house and cornering customers at work. The suit asked for damages for emotional distress and a formal acknowledgement that his behavior had caused real harm. Lionel's lawyer contacted him about the filing, and they spent 2 months negotiating a settlement to avoid going to trial. The final agreement had Lionel paying a modest amount to each of the 3 women and providing written apologies that acknowledged specific incidents and their impact. The settlement required Lionel to write individual apology letters to Madison, the dental hygienist, and the former co-worker, spelling out exactly what he'd done and admitting it was wrong. His lawyer helped him draft the letters, and I'm sure they were more legally strategic than genuinely sorry, but at least the women got formal acknowledgement on paper. Madison texted me after receiving hers to say the apology didn't fix anything or undo the fear she'd felt, but it was more than she'd expected to get, and it felt like some kind of closure. 6 months after Mia's sentencing, her probation officer sends updates saying she's following all the rules, including therapy twice a week, and staying away from Lionel completely. Her social media accounts that used to post constantly about destiny and soulmates have gone quiet on that stuff and now just show her graduate research and school projects. I check her profiles sometimes even though I probably shouldn't, and the shift feels too clean, like she just turned off a switch, which makes me think the obsession is still there underneath, but the probation monitoring keeps it contained. Lionel still checks his security camera feeds every single day before leaving his apartment, and probably always will. That habit burned into him permanently. His therapist says he's made small improvements in recognizing when he crosses boundaries with women at his new retail job, though the progress comes in tiny steps with plenty of backsliding. His manager called me last month as his emergency contact to say Lionel got promoted to shift supervisor, and there haven't been any complaints from customers or co-workers about inappropriate behavior. The manager sounded cautiously optimistic, but said they're watching closely, given his history. Lionel and I barely talk anymore beyond occasional texts about practical stuff, and when we do see each other at family events, the conversation stays surface level and awkward. Luke hasn't spoken to me since I agreed to testify for Madison's civil suit, and he's made it clear through other family members that I betrayed blood for outsiders. I've accepted that some relationships don't survive the consequences of everyone's actions, including my own, and trying to force reconciliation would just create more damage. Looking back now, I understand that trying to teach someone empathy by making them experience trauma just creates more victims and solves nothing real. Lionel went through genuine terror for months, and it didn't make him connect his experience to what he'd done to Madison and the others. It just made him feel like the world's biggest victim, while everyone else was lying about their experiences. Mia's obsession caused serious harm, whether it started as a psychology experiment or was real from the beginning, and I helped set that whole thing in motion, thinking I was teaching some kind of lesson. The legal system provided some structure and consequences through restraining orders and probation monitoring, but it couldn't fix the underlying problems or create the moment of realization I naively expected would happen. I volunteer now at the organization that helps stalking victims document evidence and navigate protection orders, doing concrete work that actually helps people instead of playing around with psychological experiments. The situation is managed now with court orders and therapy requirements and probation check-ins, but it's not resolved in any satisfying way where everyone learned and grew. It's just contained enough that Lionel can work his retail job and Mia can finish her degree and Madison can move forward with her life, all of them carrying damage that won't fully heal. That's the best outcome I can hope for, given what I set in motion, and I've learned to focus on practical harm reduction rather than expecting dramatic transformations that probably won't come.